one of the things that we've done ever since the first Ideas Festival is commission a poll. And for the last 3 years, we've been doing that collaboratively with our very good friends at Penn Schoen and Berland. And we are delighted this year that we had also, not surprisingly, superb assistance and full involvement of our friends at the Atlantic. And what we do each year is we look at the tracks and the themes that we think will be most important and engaging during the Ideas Festival. And we think of what we could do in terms of a significant national poll that would illuminate those themes. And not only illuminate those themes for our audience here, but actually do something of real public significance in terms of something that's going to be newsworthy, that's going to speak to the broader American public about things that are very much on their minds, or things that are influencing national debate about critical issues. And this year, given our focus in so much of the festival on values, and particularly American values, and of course it being an election year, we thought that a detailed, thorough examination of American values would be an important and exciting thing to do. And I can tell you it was exciting and fun for those of us from the Institute, Mark and Don and their colleagues who are superb. They're the best in the business at doing polls like this. And of course, James Bennet and his associates at the Atlantic. We had a great deal of fun thinking about what kinds of questions we should be asking a national audience, keeping in mind there are only so many questions we can afford to ask or people have the time to answer. But what would be most enlightening given the themes that we're talking about? And I have to say, having had a chance to review the results of the poll a few days ago, I think my colleagues here really hit pay dirt and found some things that will be of great interest to you and are going to be of great interest, and indeed already have been if you've read The Atlantic online, to a broader public. I don't want to take any more time than that. I think the way we're going to do this is I'm going to ask Mark to present the results of the poll, and then Don and James will follow Mark after Mark gives his report and his own interpretation of some of the more salient observations and conclusions. We'll hear from his colleagues, and then I'll immediately turn to the audience, so please be thinking of questions. Mark?
Thank you. I'm going to kind of take you through the basic information and data on the poll and give you, let you kind of see the data for yourselves. Even with this presentation, it's still only a fraction of the entire poll, but we should have the entire poll publicly available for anyone who wants it through websites and so forth. But let me kind of give you, if we're going to queue up the poll. Right, this is basically a study about what Americans believe as their values. And so we've asked actually, really probably about 200 questions, and we've done about 2,000 interviews across the country of the general population, 1,000 online and 1,000 by telephone, with the online used to kind of supplement the sample size. So we have an excellent sample matched to kind of the census, so it's not a poll of voters. But we're taking a look at how America's changing. And American values are changing, particularly with the younger generation. Underlying that change is a very strong cynicism about where America is going. 70%, as you'll see, say that our values have declined. 69% say, have our values gotten stronger, or have they gotten weaker or stayed the same? A consensus among America that their values are heading in the wrong direction. Although sometimes people think their values are heading in the wrong direction, but underlying it, they may not be. But what's driving, I think, a lot of this is cynicism, as you'll see, about politics, about capitalism, about Wall Street, about all those things underlying, I think their basic values provide that underlying cynicism on the flip side, I think you'll see that people still have confidence in themselves. So if our values are declining, why are they declining? Political corruption, influence of money in politics, too much focus on money, material things, a celebrity-obsessed culture. America's concerned about the pop culture that it's becoming. And they're looking at themselves and they're saying, we may not be happy with this. The money, the materialism, the pop culture society, all of those were, I think, underscore the main reasons why they said values were declining. So when we start with values, perhaps one of the fundamental questions is, do you believe in God? A question that for a long time has run about 98, 96% of Americans. And now that's, you're up around 11% that don't believe in God, and you're at 19% among aged 18 to 29. And we had a series of other questions that ask about religion, and generally we saw religion was on the decline, particularly among younger people. Not a serious, not the kind of decline where it's 50-50, but America traditionally has run 96, 98%, at least professed belief in God. So we ran extensively a question on what do you think is morally acceptable and what do you think is morally objectionable? Well, here's where you both see the kind of change that's been occurring. So obviously at the top of the list, a woman with children working outside the home, 90% acceptability. But using contraception, an issue that was in the campaign just a few months ago, 84%. Interracial marriage, sex education, an unmarried man and woman living together, 69% now accept that. You're going to see some big differences between the older generation and the younger generation. Even though more people from the older generation are, quote, living in sin, unquote, than ever. I guess they're condemning themselves. So, divorce, 69, stem cell research, another controversial issue, but is an issue of almost consensus, 69. Capital punishment, still at about 64. Gambling, 61. Premarital sex, 60. And having a child out of wedlock, also a change, 57. The gay lifestyle, homosexuality, now at 53, also the single biggest change and also the single biggest difference between the young generation and the older. Adults viewing pornography, we slip here just below 50%. However, if you take a look at the male-female, you'll see that a lot of men support this value and a lot of women don't. Interestingly, abortion, 57%, morally objectionable. Marijuana, about the same. Censoring, about the same. Doctor-assisted suicide, something that we thought might actually have become more acceptable, is not becoming more acceptable. 60% say it's morally objectionable. Prostitution, cloning, underage drinking, illegal drugs, and at the bottom of the list, athletes using performance-enhancing drugs. So if you take a look at some of the differences, an unmarried man and woman living together, 76 acceptable for the younger generation, 45% for the older generation. Homosexuality, 62% acceptable for the younger generation, 36% acceptable for the older generation. Smoking marijuana, majority of the younger generation, 21% of the older generation. Abortion, again, same kind of pattern. Now, one thing I have to caution at looking at younger generations. Younger generations have a habit of changing as they get older, have families, jobs, and responsibility. The current older generation is really the Kennedy generation. So imagine what was happening in the 60s, and then below that, the 70s. Those same people now are the most morally conservative group. And yet, I'm really quite confident, had I done the same poll at that time, I'd be looking at the same figures among the younger generation for the same group. Now, if government, and we did this, is paying the medical bills, should someone on life support be required to be kept alive? Yes, 56%. Interestingly, even though there's a lot of support here for government helping to make sure that everyone has access to affordable health care, when it came to, in essence, pulling the plug on life support, unless people explicitly said they wanted to do it, you saw a really strong objection to doing that. And even when you put it in the context that the government's footing the bill, people said absolutely yes. Again, general responsibility of government to make sure that all Americans have, and majority said food, access to health care coverage, high school education. They split on a home to live in, they split on a job, and they didn't think a college education was something the government should be providing. Health insurance, which is closer to you? Health insurance should be required to provide care for people who have pre-existing conditions, even if the government has to pay for it, 77. Pre-existing conditions can be very expensive, and health insurers or the government shouldn't be required to pay for them, only 20%. Health insurance should be required to provide care for people who have pre-existing conditions, as you can see, one of the more popular elements of the health care bill. Which is closer to your view? Government should exert more influence over America's health care system in an attempt to lower costs and provide health care. Government should reduce the amount of influence it has over the health care system. Interesting question. I think in the past we would have thought this was split the other way. This might have been 60-40, reduce the influence of government. Big partisan split here between Democrats and Republicans, but 55% of independents are saying maybe we need the government to come in here and exert its influence. Now, one of the biggest surprises to me on the poll were attitudes towards handgun control and self-defense. 64% said there should not be a law that would ban possession of handguns, except by the police and authorized persons. And we went back and looked at the Gallup poll, and this continues a trend since 1980, where people are rejecting handgun control in bigger numbers. And then we asked them, do you believe that Americans should have the right to use deadly force to defend themselves? 72% said that. So if you're looking for some counterintuitive trends, basically Americans are saying, more of them are saying, you know, I might want a gun and I might want to have to defend myself. Which contributes to America having stronger values, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, followed by free enterprise system and principles of equality. Most important, I think, then, if you take a look at by generation, free enterprise system is only 36% among the youngest generation. It's 61% among the oldest generation. The youngest generation put equality as a value higher than the free enterprise system. The older generation put the free enterprise system as a more important value than equality. Now again, young people can change, but this suggests a different way of thinking about the free enterprise system among a younger, higher educated group in 18 to 29. Which should be protected by freedom of speech, voting, freedom of information, majorities, commercial speech such as advertising, right on the edge, 48%. Freedom from internet censorship, 46%. Viewing pornography, only 31%. You can see on the one hand they say freedom of speech is one of their #1 values. On the other hand, luckily they don't sit on the Supreme Court because they would eliminate most of the stuff that the court protects. What is it that contributes to American values? Family was one, schools were second. Schools K through 12 have an incredibly important value. In fact, they see it as almost the primary importance of education in K through 12 is not academics, but values. And then you see books, political commentators were at the bottom, celebrities and professional athletes at the bottom. But you know, people don't always report the influence on them that people have because it's not popular. And so I suspect political commentators have a little bit more influence than people are willing to admit. Which of the following types of values are most important in your life? Family values and moral values. Religious values, now a significantly distant third. Who do you think best represents American values? Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Mitt Romney, Hillary Clinton, and Billy Graham was in there before. Okay. Yeah, he's in there. 2/3 lament the loss of traditional family life, calling it damaging to society. That included the younger generation. So on the one hand, the younger generation said, we're fine with all sorts of new living arrangements. On the other hand, we think families really are the #1 place where we get values, and we lament the loss of traditional society. Interestingly, do parents get to spend as much time with their children as they want to? 39% said they don't, but it was 49% of dads. Dads were actually the people who said today they want to spend more time with their children over moms. And 51% of Americans now believe that children can grow up successfully even if they spend most of their developmental years in daycare. Should every American have an obligation to serve his country through military service? 44%. Through public or community service? 61%. So they do support the concept of universal service if it's non-military. What are parents focused on? Preparing their children for success, and they believe that the public education system is central to American values. What do you think should be the primary values of schools, the primary goal of public schools? Instilling students with the values of dedication and hard work. The #1 thing that parents wanted to get out of schools. The schools are saying there, maybe that's what I thought the parents should be doing. The parents are sitting there saying, you know, I think that's what the schools should be doing. Preparing for careers was second. Instilling knowledge was a distant third, which shows you what their attitude is towards school, which is why every time I do a poll, they always say they want more athletics and less time in school. Grades for the public school, nationally they rated them a C, but they rated their own schools a B. So I always look at those trends where people are a little bit more cynical about the system than they are about their own schools. But very few people in either question rated the schools as excellent. They rated them as okay. And I think that's a significant feedback. They also didn't rate them as failures. 66% believe the economy is on the wrong track. The #1 issue is economy and jobs, something that we know from a zillion polls. But in your opinion, which is the primary reason wealthy Americans have achieved financial success? Because they were born into wealthy families was 49%. They worked harder than most others to be successful, 39%. So they're somewhat skeptical of American success in that sense. But what I found most reassuring about American values was 70% believe that with hard work, I can accomplish anything. That underneath the cynicism, the belief the economy is in the wrong direction, the money in politics, the corruption, the celebrity-obsessed society, they still believe in a can-do philosophy, and they're looking for leadership, I think, to bring that back out. How strongly do you agree or disagree with the statement, what's good for business is good for America? Well, as you can see, seniors believe that, but you're not going to sell that to the younger generations. They pretty much reject that as a philosophy outright, and I don't think you're going to see that significantly change. Do you think the economic system in America has been fair or unfair to the following groups? If you'll notice, a majority said unfair to middle-class Americans and working-class Americans. 46% said to women, 40% to minorities. most people thought wealthy Americans had gotten a pretty good shake. The only check I have also on the expression of cynicism about working and middle class is when I went back to look at the working and middle class citizens themselves. Most of them said they had gotten a fair shake. More of them said personally they got a fair shake out of the system. So again, there's more cynicism about society than people have about themselves and their own conditions. Now, when we got to Wall Street, I would say the results are nothing less than devastating. I mean, here, there's no nuance. 71% think that executives at large Wall Street banks who presided over significant financial losses should have gone to jail as a result of the financial crisis. And we had a series of other questions too, right? Only 17% say that those executives share fundamental values. And so the job that Wall Street has to do to convince itself that it's a beneficial force and mainstream after what happened in 2009 is a Herculean task, much bigger, I suspect, than people really think that it is. Political system, again, cynicism, our elected officials reflect mainly the values of the wealthy, 71%. Lobbyists have too much power, 74%. Too much money in a small number of groups and individuals spent on politics. So as you can see, American values, and I think we're going to have full commentary, but as I look at it, there are one or two surprises here. The stuff about assisted suicide, about not pulling the plug, about wanting to have not have as much gun control as in the past, we're having a right to self-defense. Those to me were complete surprises. The shift in social values and tolerance among younger people, not a surprise. The question is whether or not, like the older generations, they will keep that enhanced tolerance as they get older. And the cynicism of the system, enormous. Political system, free enterprise system, all of these systems really are under enormous pressure and cynicism. The only thing counterweighting to that is that 70% still think that in America you can do anything you want if you work hard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Now we'll have James Bennet, the editor of The Atlantic, tell us what his reaction to this poll was.
Thanks, Elliot. Thanks, Mark. That was a great presentation. And thank you. Mark and Don and their team did an incredible job with this poll, and it is really full of, to my mind, surprising, provocative results. I'm hoping we'll come back to a number of the things Mark pointed to: healthcare, education, parenting, campaign finance among them. I wanted to just pause briefly on a kind of what I see as an overarching theme here, which is this notion of American decline, and then specifically how it breaks down along generational lines. Because I think this confirms some of the anxiety a lot of us already have and what we suspect, but I still found it disturbing, particularly disturbing. There was one question Mark asked: are people in your generation better off or worse off than people in your parents' generation? And the top line result was only 34% overall of everybody said that this generation is better off, or that their own generation was better off than their parents' generation. 51% in all said that their generation was worse off. But when you break it down by age cohort is where it gets kind of particularly disturbing for me. 65 and older, 53%, a majority actually said they were better off than their parents were in their generation. Declines from there. 45 to 64, 36% only said that they were better off. And we can probably ascribe some of that to baby boomer whining, but I don't think all of it. And then you go below that, from 18 to 44 years old, and only 26% said overall that their generation was better off. And if you focus in on that 18 to 29% group, through a lot of this data, you see this pessimism and cynicism that Mark described over and over again, registering across the board. They're more likely to say that our values will continue to decline over the next 10 years. They're more likely to say that our values are worse than those of the rest of the world. They're more likely to say that the US is on the wrong track. 69% of them say that it is. And to one of the points Mark just raised about, well, do you think that the wealthy got that way because they worked harder or because of family connections and more opportunities? They're more likely to say the latter. 56% of them think that the wealthy got that way because of their connections, which is a notion that is, in my mind, just fundamentally antithetical to the American idea. Now, all of that is happening despite the fact that this young, and now I'm really talking about the 18 to 29-year-old group, is growing up with a more open society, a more tolerant society as reflected in this poll than we've ever known, and also with all the blessings of this digital revolution, fantastic scientific advances that are putting them in a world that their parents really couldn't have dreamed of just a generation ago. Although, by the way, this same group, 18 to 29, is most likely to say that the media is having a negative impact on American values. Declinism is a very, very old idea in American society. It's actually older than the Republic itself. Within a few years of the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, ministers were already lamenting the lost golden years of the early founding of the colony, and there's been a tradition of Jeremiads in American society, from John Winthrop to Henry Adams and on, where we've been terrified that the virtues that sustained us and have sustained us are collapsing. And this is actually something that's unique to American culture in the world and is arguably part of our success. So we've always been able to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. But just because we've always been wrong about decline in the past doesn't mean we're not eventually going to be right about it. And I do think the fundamental question to all of us is if we're going to be the first generation that winds up leaving less opportunity behind. And that's my scariest inference from this data. I'll shut up there. I would like to plant one question with the audience for Don and Mark later, which is I would love to hear them talk about how you would construct a presidential campaign based on these results.
Is anyone asking?
We'll get to that. Don, you want to just tell us what your...
Sure, and I'll go quickly. And I want to start off with some thank yous, too, because there's a great enterprise that we go into to James and his colleagues at The Atlantic, Bob Cohn at theatlantic.com, and others for all the great work together and how much they put behind this. And especially to Elliot and Kitty Boone. We start talking about this poll back in December, January every year, what we want to do. It's wonderful to see those of you who were there yesterday when Elliot did his summary of the Supreme Court decision. In such an elegant way, he put on display his great talents as a former Supreme Court clerk. It's wonderful to work with Elliot every year and to see what a great pollster he could be. So we appreciate all of that. I would just say three things. Some of these have been echoed already. And I always try to, I think I did last year, look for the shards of optimism here where perhaps we don't see them otherwise. So first off, I think we do see trend lines towards greater tolerance about different kinds of lifestyles than we have seen in the past. That is, of course, contrasted against the pessimism to the point of cynicism that people have about the free enterprise system in particular and the potential for our capitalist system to continue to do the work that it has done for such a long period of time, and to James's point about the concern about what we are leaving to the next generation. And yet, as I look at this, there are two things that jump out at me. One, Mark noted the can-do spirit. People still believe that if they work hard, they play by the rules, and they really devote themselves to the task at hand, they can build better lives for themselves and their families. And the other one that I think is actually quite remarkable was the 61% of the public that favors mandatory community service. This happens to be a subject that I've been interested in for a long time. And if you look into the data, it's across the board. Every generation, every demographic group, every region, every ethnic group. And I think it touches on something that comes through beneath beneath the surface in some of this as we go, which is a craving, a yearning that people have for a fundamental American value that I think of as the duty we owe to one another, the duty we owe to country, to community, to our families. And I would suggest that the role of leadership, and this speaks somewhat to your point, James, about what kind of presidential campaign one might run, the role of leadership perhaps is to speak to the better angels of our nature, as Lincoln said, when it comes to the can-do spirit and this notion of the duty that we owe to one another, and perhaps to try to lift that up above this sense of decline that people are afraid of.
Well, thank you. I think what I'm going to do is the reverse of the usual moderator's routine, which is I will reserve my questions to the end, thinking pretty confidently that there will be no time left, and immediately turn it over to all of you, because I think this raises so many interesting questions, and I've already had a chance to ask them my questions. So what I'm going to do is just open it up if we are ready to do that, because I'm not sure we are. We have to wait for microphones because all of this is taped. And but just one comment though, which is you picked up, Don. I think this poll reflects two critical elements, sort of in American character, American history. Both the individual ethic, how we ourselves can accomplish what we want, but also that communitarian spirit that maybe the younger generation is reclaiming in greater numbers. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, right in the middle. With all these tables, it's a bit of a challenge to...
It's okay.
Do we only have one microphone?
We have two.
We have two, okay.
My name is Sylvia Stalker. I'm from Brunswick, Maine. I'm curious about the word that you use for homosexuality, using the word lifestyle. I'm wondering why it was included in the survey as a lifestyle as opposed to an orientation, where the word lifestyle to me implies choice, whereas orientation is how I understand homosexuality to be.
Actually, neither was used in the poll. Only the word homosexuality was in the poll. I apologize for my adding that.
Let's come up to the front if we can. Oh, actually, well, Joe, you're closer, and then the woman in the front.
So there's a ringer questionnaire in the hall here.
I'm not sure we want this question.
Well, no, I have a quick comment and a question, and it's based on what Don just said, which I agree with 100%, and it's what I find when I go out on the road and talk to people, that they're really yearning. People bring up national service unbidden. I don't even have to ask them about it, and they say, we need to have something like that to bring people together. The comment is that the one group I found in this country that combines all of the values, Don, that you just mentioned is the United States military, especially this generation of veterans who have been trained in counterinsurgency and believe in public service. The question I'd ask Mark is, how did that question fall out generationally? How do young people feel about it? My guess is that they're more skeptical.
On mandatory community service? Yeah. I hear Mark.
Yeah, I don't think, let's see.
It's actually, they're a little bit lower, but not much.
Yeah. If you looked at it, the 18 to 29, the people who would have to do the service were 60-39. The older generation that would like to see them do the service were 73-23. So there was a difference, but it didn't cross the line. And you know, the truth is, when you look at all the other attitudes of this generation, this is a generation maybe uniquely suited to be galvanized by this kind of public service in their outlook and attitudes. Not since maybe Kennedy, I think, would I think people be doing that. When Clinton did it, I think the younger generation was actually much more economic and success oriented. This group is, well, I think that's...
Yeah, many people are saying this, like, what do they call it, the millennial generation actually do have different attitudes.
So let me though, just to fill out the view, the second question was, should every American have an obligation to serve his or her country through military service? And there, the generational skew was dramatic. So under 30s, only 34% support it. over 65, 67%. And it's actually sort of a straight curve downward across the generational line.
And we know what the numbers look like when those people who are over 65 face the same question.
I do, just the last thing on this I would say, I do think there's a growing recognition of the burden that has been borne in the wars that we have fought in the last decade by a small group of Americans who have stepped up and performed the service to the country that we all needed them to perform. And that there's a sense perhaps of guilt, or some sense that we owe something back, not just to those people as individuals and as families, which we surely do, but also to the country as a whole, so that we're more all a part of this in terms of the sacrifice and contribution that's made.
Just one little sign of this, I just happened to think about and contrast with what attitudes were like not that long ago. If any of you go to Nationals baseball games this year, there's at one point in between, I think, third and fourth inning where recently returned veterans are recognized, and it's a standing ovation like none other you see game after game after game, and all the young people. Question right here in the front, I think, or if you still have a question.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Sherman. I teach American politics at American University, and I want to follow up on this theme about this sense that people owe something to the country, people owe something to one another, and that's manifested by the poll results on national service. But there's also this feeling that the government is failing the country, that the economic system is failing the country. Among my students, I hear a real anger that the government has not and will not do anything about global warming, pollution, the environment, because of the control of corporations and the influence over government. And I also hear them say that their opportunities are going to be very limited when they graduate, because the economic system only benefits, maybe not the top 1%, but the already wealthy who benefit from globalization, and that they are not going to do well in an unfair system.
Yeah, I think everything you've said runs through this poll. Now, the real question is, the second question is, are they right about that or not?
Right.
So what's so fascinating is, you know, college-educated unemployment is really quite low. It's at full employment, particularly, and then anyone that goes into the STEM sciences, right now we can't even fill the jobs. And the new professional jobs that are being created are in many ways new opportunities that never even existed. So is the reality that all of those things are true, or is it that the cynicism itself is feeding on itself and creating, you know, if you go back, this is the longest period that I could find in what I call recorded polling history that the public has remained negative or pessimistic about the country. Usually we go through 2 or 3 years and then we turn around and say, aha, we have Reagan, aha, we elected so and they change. Now, this has not happened now for I think 8 straight years, and so those kids you teach haven't seen their parents be positive about the country for almost a decade during the years that they were growing up, and I think that's going to have a profound long-term influence.
But it also, though, the attitude, that negative attitude about government makes the healthcare finding that much more startling, I think, in the poll, because despite this pervasive cynicism about the ability of government to get anything done, people want government involved in their healthcare system, and it's on the one hand, they say that healthcare is a responsibility of the government. 69% say that. Now, you could discount some of that and say they believe a functioning government should be more involved, but they don't think this one can. But then Mark specifically drilled down and asked the question, you know, should the government exert more influence over healthcare in an attempt to lower costs and provide healthcare coverage for all Americans? 54% say yes. And young people are more likely than old people who are beneficiaries of government-funded healthcare already to say yes to that. So
Let me ask Mark and Don that. And again, we've heard about this the last few days. Given what the poll found, why does so-called Obamacare poll so poorly? Is that a problem of political salesmanship? How do you explain that discrepancy?
Well, first, to explain this difference, they are not that cynical about government and what it can do. They are cynical about our political leaders and what they are doing. And that's really the distinction. Because I've done a lot of polls on this, and they like the government system and the checks and balances. And they think the current occupants all over the place are not representing their values in the fullest sense.
Although that word cloud of who do you think are the best exemplars of our values are all politicians, except for Oprah, who's kind of a politician.
Jon Stewart was in that word cloud too, by the way, if you didn't notice, which is interesting.
So never never underestimate the ability for Americans to have several completely contradictory thoughts in their mind at exactly the same time. That is the way most Americans function. And it depends which pedal really is being pushed at any particular time. And so I do think that there is a narrative that is being furthered by the political commentators that is helping to spin the country down. There are very few forces right now out there trying to spin the country up. And I do think that is a problem in the middle of an expanding global economy and technological revolution. Now, what was your question?
About the difference between the reaction to the healthcare questions there and what we always hear about why President Obama isn't saying more about his healthcare, or maybe that'll change as of yesterday, legislation, because it, quote, doesn't poll well.
Well, okay, because the truth is the specific legislation itself hasn't polled well. The concept, do you want all Americans covered by health insurance, has always polled well. And the difference has been getting from the concept to the reality. Because somewhere on the way to the concept and the reality are costs, who benefits, and who pays. And their belief of the Obama program, and the reason when you drill down is 85% of voters now currently have health insurance. So the first thing they say is, I don't benefit, someone else benefits. Then they say, well, who's paying for it? Me. Now, I'm not saying that this is right or wrong, I just want you to understand. This is the logic of why the program is so opposed.
One thing, the question, maybe Mark, you mentioned the concern of your students about climate change, and actually this poll did not reflect a tidal wave of worry on that subject, right?
There's too much economic concern at the moment. Typically, when there was less economic concern and full unemployment, you saw surging concern about global warming or climate change. We're not seeing that even among young people now as much as you saw before.
Gentleman front.
Yes, my name is Henry Tischler, and I'm a sociologist. And you had one question there about schools, and people said the schools were not so great, but my school is okay. And my experience is that a lot of times people have this impression that things out there are pretty bad, but for themselves, it's not as bad. So I might want to suggest maybe things are not as bad as the original impression, that people are sort of putting out this view that out there it's bad, but for me, it's not that bad.
Well, that's, again, I come back to this, how much are we spinning down our own society beyond reality? And I do think we have to be careful about that. And that's why, actually, in the poll, we asked both, because I wanted to do a check on exactly that. One of the more interesting questions I ever asked on this was, I was probing to see whether parents were disciplinarian or not. And every parent said they themselves were strong disciplinarians, but all of their neighbors were loosey-goosey.
Can we have the microphone over here in the front?
Do you think the decreasing focus on materialism is a temporary condition based on the Great Recession, or is this going to be a permanent trend?
Well, clearly people have scaled back. I suspect it's not a permanent trend because that's in part what the American system is about, which is a sense of rising expectations over time. To me, it's a real question of at what point and when do we click back into a spirit of growth in our economy, which, as we all know, and there are many business people here in this audience, is in part what's really going on in the economy, and it's in part the perception and the psychology of what's going on in the economy, which goes back to Mark's point about trying to talk the country up rather than talk the country down. I think materialism is probably here to stay.
Okay, in the second row here, Paul Anderson.
Do you have any hypotheses to explain the findings on handgun possession and self-defense and were there important generational differences on that question, on those two questions?
Check on that. While they check on the generational differences, you know, again, I don't have specific evidence. My hypothesis would be that they are less trusting of police and society to protect themselves, and that they see a greater need for self-protection. And that I think both of those questions tended to me to reflect that. And so if you're cynical about everything else, and that it's representative of what we see in the poll of the increased self-reliance that people see as a need to get through. And in terms of generationally, I would say no. No real statistically significant difference.
By the way, how can people get this level of detail? Are we going to have this on our website,
it's
your
all-
website, James?
It's all on our website.
It's all on the Atlantic website.
Theatlantic.com, it's all there with an article that Mark has written that analyzes it.
it's a
and
wonderful
articles
analysis,
from the
actually.
Atlantic staff about it as
Ton
well.
of stuff on this, lots
think-
of other good stuff too.
Dan, is that you back there, microphone?
Thank you. Hi, Don and Mark.
Hey, Dan.
I want to pick up on Mark's point about the length of distrust and alienation, this prolonged period of people feeling that the institutions are failing. I would suggest that that might be a response to, particularly as it relates to the loss of trust in the business system, the economic system, Wall Street, to the fact that our political system has failed to respond to this broad disgust and lack of trust in the fairness of this system. First, you had the Tea Party, which their numbers have gone way down in terms of their public support. And then you had Occupy Wall Street rise on the left. They never were able to get traction and build any kind of consensus. And then the president, in his recent remarks, has tried to appeal to that sense of populism, but has not gotten much traction beyond his core base. And even there's, I would say, a lukewarmness. And then no one is ever going to consider Mitt Romney to be the standard bearer for this budding movement. So my question is, how likely do you think it is that there will rise up organically someone to give voice to that broad frustration that is not tainted by the far right or the far left, but is more of a Huey Long type populist, someone who would have credibility with working class voters and run a true classic populist campaign? And if so, who do you think is on the horizon that could potentially fill that bill?
Well, let me just say, I don't think that's the route to either electoral success or bringing the country together. I think, if anything, us spinning us down is creating more divisions, and that's more of a problem than a solution. So if you go back to 1996 and the early days of the presidential campaign, Pat Buchanan tried to be that person. And he basically did a pretty good job convincing everybody at that time the economy was terrible, it was those countries overseas that were to blame, Washington, all the jobs were hamburger flipper jobs, and the country
And our values were in decline.
And our values were in decline. So he was, and so we came in, as you recall, President Clinton then declared in the State of the Union, no, it's the best economy in a generation, and he then lifted America into the new economy. And as a result, I think, brought people together into a common national success that they would have in the midst of a global economy and a technological revolution. And no president has really successfully done that since then. And the global economy is bigger than ever before, and the technological revolution is bigger than ever before. So we're going back into exactly the same cycle. I think people could fall into the populist trap, right? But that won't actually bring the country together and bring out the underlying values of success, of education, and as we did and talked about in the new professional panel, I'm still waiting for the presidential candidate that will say, I'm going to create 10 million new economy jobs, the way President Clinton said. Everybody's always putting as number one manufacturing jobs. Manufacturing jobs are important, but just as important are creating new economy jobs for the growing ranks of college-educated who put the country on the leading edge because we are still the center of technological revolution. So you're right, someone could emerge as the populist candidate, but someone else could emerge as the 21st century candidate who's really going to take this country forward, and that's the missing ingredient, I think.
Nothing more I could say to that.
Okay. Gentleman over here in the back.
Hi. I was just wondering, in light of this trend of cynicism that you've displayed here, how do you reconcile the fact that 71% of the American public believes that if they work hard enough, they can pull themselves up by their bootstrap? I mean, doesn't it seem like, in the face of it, it's like a little child saying, no, it really is an Easter bunny?
You know what? Think about what the country is hearing and has been hearing. First off, from the media, Joe said something, I think it was Joe yesterday, that was very profound when he sort of said, I hope that our colleagues in the media who are on the cable channels right now are not taking the cynical view about this decision and are recognizing that this is a unifying decision for the country and perhaps moves us forward. Most of the narrative publicly, coming from the media and unfortunately from our political leaders, right up to the very top, is all about how the system is rigged, whether it's the political system, the economic system, that someone is getting something that you're not getting, that they're taking advantage of some specific advantage that they've had. There are elements of truth in that, especially with regard to some of the economic difficulties that we faced in recent years. But when that's the narrative that is being driven through the means through which most people are able to absorb what they understand and see about what's happening in the country, it is very difficult to fight against that with what is the fundamental belief that people have, that they're raised with in their families. You saw the importance of family, that what they're raised with in their schools. You saw the importance of schools. What we basically know about the very long history of this country and our economic advancement and social advancement over time, that says that doesn't mesh with what I understand and what I see I'm able to do when I really double down and do things. And so, you know, I question which one is the Easter Bunny and who has what reason to try to drive people to divide them and to sort of lead them to sort of rub sore those wounds that are there rather than figuring out how we heal them and move the country forward.
One question over here. Gentlemen.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Mitchell Gans. I'm from New York. I teach courses at the law school, a couple of law schools in New York in taxation. And I'm interested in the healthcare issue. And I'm wondering about it in these terms. It seems to me that one thing that's floating around in the discussion and in our feelings about it is some libertarian value. And why I think of that is I think of the individual mandate and the opposition that we saw to the individual mandate. On the other hand, it seems to me there's our feelings about taxation. And of course, we saw all of this come to fruition yesterday in the decision because, of course, Justice Roberts went with the taxing power and was concerned about the individual mandate in terms of the commerce power. But I'm wondering if President Obama chose the less effective approach in the way he sold it. He was afraid of taxation, of saying, I mean, and it seemed to me always that this would have been a more effective narrative to say, look, you know, it's a moral imperative that we provide universal health care. And in order to do so, we have to pay for it. And so we're going to do that in the form of imposing some form of taxation on this person or that person. But instead of selling it that way, we wound up with he backed away from that. He didn't want it to be a tax because he was afraid of how that would play. And then we wound up with this individual mandate that came across as somebody coercing me into doing something I don't want to do. And then we wound up with this libertarian thing. And I wonder at the end of the day if Justice Roberts didn't get it exactly right by saying, you know what, I'm not going to go down the road of coercion because that does bother me in terms of this libertarian value, if you will. But taxation, that I can do. That's not as offensive or as coercive. I wonder what you think about that.
Well, look, I think it was, in many ways, it was a brilliant decision, you know, being able to split off those two elements. Now, at the end of the day, Obama himself in the 2008 campaign opposed the mandate. In fact, he sent out a few million mailers that a certain candidate of mine wasn't too happy about on the same topic. And So the truth is the mandate itself, if you approach this from the mandate, it's going to be unpopular. If you approach this from the point of view, number one, Americans want as much health care as will give them a longer life and will give them access to new medical techniques as God could possibly afford. You know, that's the truth. I mean, that's their attitude. And everything else flows from that. But interestingly, political figures never start with the goal of healthcare is to create the longest, healthiest lives for all our country. And how do we do that? And if I were going to sell a healthcare plan, that's where I would start. And so what would be the legs of that? They would be the legs of universal coverage, of quality second to none, of getting the legal system as much out of the medical system as possible. And you're getting a very strong message that they want the government to help, you know, with costs, but they don't want the government to help with medical decisions. And that's why I think you see this very strong backing off of whether it's doctor-assisted suicide or pulling the plug at any price.
We're just about to run out of time, but I want to come back to James's question before we end. Mark and Don, as well as being among the best pollsters in the world, are regarded as among the best campaign strategists in the world. So you each get to choose a candidate, President Obama or Governor Romney. Based on these polls, what would you recommend?
You know, I think it doesn't matter whether it's, you know, based on this poll, either, you know, I'd make the same recommendations, because the question is the next candidate or next president going to be somebody who got there by tearing this country down or building this country up? And the answer is going to be building this country up. And I think the candidate who can rekindle the values of self-reliance, of can-do, of making it in the global economy, of how we're going to compete, of an educational system that fits with our values, of a healthcare system that does its responsibility to everyone. That's the kind of candidate I would recommend either one. And look, Obama filled that space in 2008. It's why I think he won with such an extensive margin, because the Hope and Change campaign did exactly that.
Don, you get the last word.
It's amazing how much he and I agree on these things. The only thing I will add to it are two things. One, that spirit needs to be infused with specificity, that people will not buy just the words. They need concrete directions. That doesn't mean that you have to sink to the level of 57-page programs and the like, but people want to know what the plan and the program will be to help move us forward, but based on that kind of ethic. And the other thing that I would say, it speaks to the very title of this session, communicate in terms of values, not programs, not dollars and cents, not what's being taken away or being given, but the values that we talked about. That spirit of can-do and being able to accomplish things and overcome our obstacles, that spirit of the duty that we all owe to one another, whether it's to the elderly, to the young, et cetera, so that we can actually lift the country up. And to do that in a practical, realistic, and steady, sustainable way. That's the same advice I would give to either candidate.
Well, thank you. And remember, you can go to Atlantic.com to continue this conversation and actually add your own comments there. Let me thank our terrific panel.